Okay, so here we go. We're going to jump right into this is the second video for John Dewey's Art as Experience. We're still in chapter 1, the live creature. Let me get the PowerPoint going here, and we're going to sort of just dive right in where we left off. I was looking ahead at the material, and it looks like we're probably going to have to split the first chapter into 3 videos. I don't really like how the last one went. I think it went a little bit too long. And so again, looking ahead, I'm thinking this is probably going to be at least another 40 minutes before we even move on to chapter 2. I'll try to rush through a little bit of this because some of it, I think it's just sort of, he gets pretty repetitive here. But even though these quotes may seem a bit repetitive, I added them for a reason, right? Some of them have, some of it's just sort of recap to keep you on page here because he'll add some new points and kind of bring it back to his original points. You kind of, like, I guess, to sort of illustrate the relationship. But right now, right, again, the first chapter, we haven't really got into any positive theory yet. We've kind of just talked about some of the problems with art theory and why it doesn't work, right? Why art theory has been wrong-headed so far. Some of the problems that due to the nature of art in modern society, right? So this first quote doesn't really, I guess, jump right to that matter, but we're going to get to it in the next slide. So I better just shut up and just read the quote. And by the end of this video, we're probably going to have a good idea of exactly why the name of this chapter is The Live Creature. So far, he seems to be, John Dewey in the essay seems to be focusing primarily on the distinction between, not the distinction between, but this sort of compartmentalization of art throughout history, and his assertion that it wasn't that way, that art originally is a direct, it's directly tied to a cultural, communal life experience. And it's been sort of removed from that in more recent times due to all these forces that, again, we talked about in the last video: nationalism, imperialism, just to name a couple. And here he, again, kind of repeats the point of the inability of art theories to get to the heart of the matter because they ignore art as it actually originates in experience and where it comes from in practice. So let's see what Dewey has to say about that, right? So theories which isolate art and its appreciation by placing them in a realm of their own, disconnected from other modes of experiencing, are not inherent in the subject matter. So you don't have art. Looking at art just in itself doesn't necessitate that separation. But this arises, Dewey says, because of specifiable extraneous conditions. We talked about those in the last video, right? Again, rise of capitalism, the nation state, imperialism, industrialization, and the individualization of artists, plus these theories of art like Kant and Schopenhauer, which make aesthetic experience purely contemplative and not very active. So going on, embedded as they are in institutions and in habits of life, these conditions, the ones, these ones that separate art, operate effectively because they work so unconsciously. The theorist assumes they are embedded in the nature of things, right? So theory, again, starts with these already sort of artificial, compartmentalized conceptions of art, and that leads them astray. Nevertheless, the influence of these conditions is not confined to theory. So again, it's not just philosophers who make this mistake. For Dewey, this has creeped into the popular understanding of art. So it's not confined to theory. As I have already indicated, it deeply affects the practice of living, driving away aesthetic perceptions that are necessary ingredients of happiness, or reducing them to the level of compensating transient, pleasurable excitations, right? So in other words, this idea of art as just something that is a diversion, right? We go to the concert to get away, to de-stress, at the end of the week, and then we go back to our job, right? He doesn't like that. He thinks that this older, the art, like the Parthenon, the Greek Parthenon, this work of art that was not just beautiful and a wonderful work of art, but was also a celebration of the Athenian democracy and this symbol of civic pride. And it was utilized as an actual building in this endeavor. He doesn't like us to separate this, right? He thinks that actually this is a necessary ingredient for our happiness, but nevertheless, this is the popular conception. And so for him, the nature of the problem, from the quote here, is that of recovering the continuity of aesthetic experience with normal processes of living, right? So we need to bring art back into life, back into normal experience, and stop thinking of it as separate and segregated from all other experience. Art is not separated from life, right? Or at least it shouldn't be, and it wasn't originally for Dewey. Theory can start with and from acknowledged works of art only when the aesthetic has already been compartmentalized, or only when works of art are set in a niche apart instead of being celebrations, recognized as such of the things of ordinary experience, right? So like the Parthenon was not just a great work of art, but a celebration of, or the ordinary experience of the Athenian democrat, the Athenian citizen. Even a crude experience, if authentically an experience, is more fit to give a clue to the intrinsic nature of aesthetic experience than is an object already set apart from any other mode of experience. So you're probably wondering why I have these photos here of Joel Osteen and a picture from inside the cathedral, the Sacré-Cœur in Paris, right? Considered one of the most beautiful cathedrals in the world, the second most visited church in Paris after Notre Dame. But anyway, he might argue that if like let's say you're a parishioner, or I don't know what you would call it, a member of Joel Osteen's church, you're a member of the congregation, and you go there and you actually get some, whatever, put aside whatever you think about Joel Osteen. I know he's a pretty controversial figure. I anytime I mention him anywhere, I get all these comments about it. I don't really feel one way or the other about it, to be honest with you, but I know like there's a lot of people, who feel like, he's a fake or a fraud or whatever, but that's beside the point. If you're one of his congregation, let's say, and you go to his church on Sunday and you really have this, incredible experience of spirituality, right? Even though you might think of that as it's a crude experience compared to the beauty that you see here on the left in the church, inside the Basilica of the Sacré-Cœur, right? Still, though, if you go to the Sacré-Cœur as just a tourist and you're just looking at it, for Dewey, it loses a bit of its vibrancy. It loses its original aesthetic appeal. As opposed to let's imagine somebody who actually went to the Sacré-Cœur, back when it was first constructed, one of the members of the church there who actually was just, was transported away by the beauty and the spirituality that was invoked, right? And contemplating, these deep truths of the universe and their salvation. And, again, even if you're not a spiritual person, you can imagine, how impactful and how vibrant that experience might have been to the spiritual member of that church, right? So, he might argue that, again, some tourists going to see the Sacré-Cœur, they might be seeing art that's more beautiful or, a little bit more less crude, you might say. That's the word he uses. But still, it's not really intrinsic to the nature of aesthetic experience. You're losing that aesthetic part. For him, it's too detached. And again, this is, for my students at U of H who, by now you should understand Kant a little bit. Is a far cry from Kant, and you might even say from Schopenhauer, right? Although you could say this is a bit in line with Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche's notion of the Dionysian, and how that, in the Dionysian experience of art, we lose ourselves, right? We lose our sense of individuality. We become one, right? So you might go to see Joel Osteen and, his sermon or the songs that are being played, sure, they might not be as artful as like a Beethoven concerto, but if they move you in a certain spiritual way, I think Dewey would argue that they are more properly or authentically an experience, an aesthetic experience. So, interesting point. I don't know if you'd agree with that, right? But again, he still thinks theory loses sight of this, because theory, art theory tries to detach the artwork from, the context from which it was created and the function which it served. And Dewey thinks that you're losing something there. Inevitably, your theory is going to be wrong. And so he writes that writers of aesthetic theory often raise the question of whether aesthetic philosophy can aid in the cultivation of aesthetic appreciation. If you were in my philosophy of art class earlier this semester, remember Hume makes the point that this is possible, that through theory or through I guess rational or thoughtful debate. I mean, debate's probably the wrong word, but reflection maybe is a better word. We can become better critics. We can become better. We can develop better taste. Hume seems to think this, right? So this is a question, again, Dewey's not wrong, has been raised throughout the history of philosophy of art. The question is a branch of a general theory of criticism, which it seems to me fails to accomplish its full office if it does not indicate what to look for and what to find in concrete aesthetic objects, right? This is something I think Hume fails to do. David Hume just says, if it pleases us, and it generally pleases humanity throughout history, despite any other prejudices we might have to enjoy it, then it's seen as having higher value aesthetically. So I don't think really for Dewey that wouldn't be enough of an answer, right? That's just it sort of begs the question, well, why does it, right? This is, maybe it's true, maybe empirically, remember David Hume is an empiricist. Maybe empirically, if you look at the history of art, this is true, that works of art that we claim to be masterpieces or works of art that have just generally been accepted and generally please us, but you still haven't explained why they please us, okay? So for Dewey, again, if any theory of criticism fails to accomplish its full office, it's what it actually has to do, what it sets out to do, if it does not indicate what to look for and what to find in concrete aesthetic objects. A philosophy of art is sterilized unless it makes us aware of the function of art in relation to other modes of experience, and unless it indicates why this function is so inadequately realized, and unless it suggests the conditions under which the office would be successfully performed, right? So what are the standards, basically? What is a satisfactory execution of a work of art, right? What makes a work of art effective? First off, what is the function? What is the telos, if you want to use that Greek term, if you want to go back to Aristotle? What's the aim? What's the purpose? And under what conditions is this purpose fulfilled? And is it not fulfilled, right? What gets in the way of it, right? So again, for Dewey, any and all philosophies of art, they need to answer these concerns, right? They have to explain what art's function is in relation to other modes of experience, what makes it different or similar to other modes of experience, and how or why does a work of art adequately or inadequately fulfill this function. And he writes that no amount of ecstatic eulogy of finished works can of itself assist the understanding or the generation of such works. So again, I think that this is maybe an area where he will disagree with Schopenhauer. Well, I don't know if he disagrees with them. Maybe that's not the right way to put it, but I would say if he read Schopenhauer, and I'm assuming he has, he doesn't mention him in this book, but I'm assuming that he would probably accuse Schopenhauer of this, of eulogizing beauty, right? For Schopenhauer, you can't put it into words. You're at one with the universe. It's this will that you have a direct experience of your own will, and you just have to understand that the whole universe is a part of that will. You're one with it. And so when you see, for instance, a flower growing, that is the will. That's the will trying to become a flower, trying to become this beautiful plant. And so when you experience art, it is this sort of ecstatic experience. Now, again, he's not denying that you can't enjoy art if you can't explain it, but he's talking about being a philosopher of art. So again, flowers can be enjoyed without knowing about the interactions of soil, air, moisture, and seeds, of which they are the result, but they cannot be understood without taking just these interactions into account. And theory is a matter of understanding, right? So we mentioned this a little bit in the last video, right? I can understand, or I can appreciate the beauty of a flower without knowing about all the, the properties that make it able to be beautiful. I need to know about soil, air, moisture, etc. But if I'm a theorist and I understand it, I do. So Dewey thinks that to be a good philosophy of art, esthetician, right? Somebody who does a philosophy of art, who practices aesthetics, this is key. We have to do this. We can't be like Hume and just say, oh, well, it just pleases us. To be fair to Hume, there is a point in his essay, and I can't quote it verbatim, but he says something to the effect that, certain things are enjoyable to humans just because of the way that we're framed, right? So he seems to be alluding to biology. And I think that's kind of, where Dewey is coming from too. He's going to get a little bit more in detail about this. He's not a scientist, right? He's not a biologist, so he's not going to get, don't think he's going to jump into like evolutionary biology and things like this. But he is going to tie it to the idea of being a living organism, interacting with the environment, and how that interaction with our environment leads to this notion of art and the need for art and its origins in that experience, right? The experience of a living organism adapting to its environment. So theory, he says, is concerned with discovering the nature of the production of works of art and of their enjoyment in perception. How is it that the everyday making of things grows into that form of making, which is genuinely artistic? Again, this is the problem. How did art come about? What's the origin of art? This is a problem we're going to see in the Heidegger lectures, right? He focuses on the origins of a work of art. Where does it come from? What is the basis for art? What does art tell us? What is its function? I think these are concerns that Dewey and Heidegger both share, right? How is it that our everyday enjoyment of scenes and situations develops into the peculiar satisfaction that attends to the experience, which is emphatically aesthetic? These are the questions that theory must answer. And the answers cannot be found unless we are willing to find the germs and roots in matters of experience that we do not currently regard as aesthetic. In other words, our everyday normal experience. We got to look to just our everyday sort of practical engagement with the world and sort of understand what experience is in general before we understand what it is to be an aesthetic experience. So having discovered these active seeds, we may follow the course of their growth into the highest forms of finished and refined art. So he's going to talk about the living creature. Now we finally get into really more, detail, addressing the title of the chapter, right? Why did he title this chapter The Live Creature? We're still kind of in the dark about that, right? But being a living organism, being a live animal, for Dewey, understanding what that means and the nature of being a living organism and being a living being dealing with one's environment, to understand that is a necessary prerequisite to understanding any aesthetic experience at all, right? I think that should hopefully be somewhat clear at this point. So let's read this quote here, where he finally starts to get to the details here of this notion of the live creature. So the nature of experience is determined by the essential conditions of life. While man is other than bird and beast, he shares basic vital functions with them and has to make the same basal adjustments if he is to continue the process of living. Having the same vital needs, man derives the means by which he breathes, moves, looks, and listens, the very brain with which he coordinates his senses and his movements from his animal forebears. This is interesting. we're going to get more into this notion of dealing with my environment. But when we get to this notion of overcoming the obstacles that my environment presents, I can't help but think of Schopenhauer here. And of course, Schopenhauer is a far cry, I would say, from Dewey. But it's interesting how many of these philosophies of art all come to some point where they have to confront this notion of strife and tension that is somehow inherent in life and must be represented in works of art, and might even be the impetus for works of art. That might be something Nietzsche would agree with, and Dewey, it seems to be saying that as well. So the environment plays a key role in the aesthetic of a culture, right? We look at these pictures here. We've got the Inuit. He has to adapt to his environment, right? The woman living in the desert has to adapt to her environment, and the objects that they use and create, the technology, the implementations that they create to overcome the impediments that the environment presents to them. These, for Dewey, are the seeds of art, the seeds of artistic creation. So the first great consideration is that life goes on in an environment, not merely in it, but because of it, through interaction with it. No creature lives merely under its skin. Its subcutaneous organs are means of connection with what lies beyond its bodily frame, to which, in order to live, it must adjust itself by accommodation and defense, but also by conquest. The career and destiny of a living being are bound up with it, with its interchanges with its environment, not externally, but in the most intimate way, right? So humans, or any live creature, is not just a product, but sort of an intimate, intertwined element of its environment, right? And the way that it adapts to that environment is a key, I would say, or Dewey will say, to understanding the art or the implementations that occur as a result of this this encounter. I hate to use the word encounter because that still seems to separate the creature from the environment in a much greater degree, I think, than Dewey would like us to think, or Dewey would allow. In this regard, I think Dewey, although as far as I know, him and Heidegger didn't really read much of each other, if any of each other's work, probably ignored each other. But this, I think, they share this in common, especially if you read the early work of Heidegger. This idea that myself, the notion of myself, the individual, is intimately tied to my environing world. That's the term that Dewey would use, my environing world, or my environ, right? Heidegger would just talk about the world or world structure. So there's this embeddedness of all of us in our environment, and we are, in a certain sense, a reflection of our environment and our adaptation to that environment. So every need, say hunger for fresh air or food, is a lack that denotes at least a temporary absence of adequate adjustments with surroundings. So there's this inherent tension at most times between ourselves and our environment. I'm sure modernity and all the luxuries of technology have helped to ease this tension, and we don't feel it, I think, to the extent that we used to, perhaps, when we were, cavemen, hunter and gatherers, our species. But nevertheless, this is an element of our experience, is this overcoming this tension. At the very least, we were going to get hungry and need some food to satisfy our hunger. We're never ever going to be fully satiated, right? This just doesn't happen. So again, this reminds me quite a bit of Schopenhauer, but of course, Schopenhauer is coming from, probably the perspective of the Buddhist or the Hindu philosopher, and thinking more in terms of, my subjective contemplative self trying to deal with reality and the sort of struggles and attachments that bind to my ego, and letting go of those. Whereas I think Dewey is really thinking about this strictly in terms of sort of a Darwinian biological perspective, right? We're adapting, survival of the fittest, the environment changes us and we adapt to it. And in a certain sense, we're unaware of this. So it's also a demand, right? The environment is a demand, a reaching out into the environment to make good the lack and to restore adjustment by building at least a temporary equilibrium. Life itself consists of phases in which the organism falls out of step with the march of surrounding things and then recovers unison with it, either through effort or by some happy chance. And in a growing life, the recovery is never mere return to a prior state, for it is enriched by the state of disparity and resistance through which it has successfully passed. And if the gap between the organism and the environment is too wide, the creature dies. If its activity is not enhanced by the temporary alienation, it merely subsists. Life grows when a temporary falling out is a transition to a more extensive balance of the energies of the organism with those conditions under which it lives. There's a lot going on here in this quote. Obviously, it's a long quote. But this reminds me of the famous quote from Nietzsche, right? Whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Not so much for Dewey. There's another option, right? It's either going to make you stronger, and I guess that's like that's the positive, right? You know, if the gap is too wide, you'll die, right? So it will kill you, right? If the activity is not enhanced, it just subsists. So it doesn't make you stronger. You just subsist. You're able to sort of maintain your status as a living creature, right? But there's something about overcoming tension and overcoming these encumberments, these temporary lacks, these temporary absences that call out for adjustment. If we're able to adapt to them properly and incorporate that into our being, and Nietzsche's right, it makes us stronger, right? What doesn't kill us makes us stronger, right? So it gives us a fuller, richer, more complex experience, right? A more lived experience, a more complex, more fruitful. I don't know if the fruitful is the right word, but extensive. That's the word he likes to use, right? An extensive way of life. So these are commonplaces. We're always struggling, right? We're as insofar as we're a living being, insofar as we're an organism, we're always in this mode of tension and struggling and overcoming. But these biological commonplaces are something more than that. They reach to the roots of the aesthetic in experience. If life continues, and if in continuing it expands, right? They're gonna that word expansion, right? If we overcome these obstacles, and through this overcoming, we expand our existence, we expand our possibilities and our mode of being. In that case, there's an overcoming of factors of opposition and conflict, right? If life continues and if continues expands, there is an overcoming of factors, opposition and conflict. There's a transformation of them into differentiated aspects of a higher powered and more significant life. We have more power, more significance, more fulfillment potentially in our life. The marvel of organic, of vital adaptation through expansion instead of by contraction and passive accommodation actually takes place, right? So instead of just contracting and shrinking from the problem, instead of just passively accommodating ourselves to the problem, we overcome it, we conquer it, right? That takes place for Dewey. Here is the germ, here in germ are balance and harmony attained through rhythm. Equilibrium comes about not mechanically and inertly, but out of it and because of tension, right? So tension creates the capacity for the aesthetic in experience. Because there's tension, because there's these moments of instability and these other moments of equilibrium, this is the basis, this is the germ in all living experience for the aesthetic. Order, he says, cannot but be admirable in a world constantly threatened with disorder, in a world where living creatures can go on living only by taking advantage of whatever order exists about them, incorporating it into themselves. In a world like ours, every living creature that attains sensibility welcomes order with a response of harmonious feeling whenever it finds a congruous order about it. For only when an organism shares in the ordered relations of its environment does it secure the stability essential to living. And when the participation comes after a phase of disruption and conflict, it bears within itself the germs of a consummation akin to the aesthetic, right? So that's the clue in experience, right? That's where we get this notion of the aesthetic. It's these moments of tension and then of, sort of resolution, right? Resolvement, overcoming, and equilibrium. And so he says, since the artist cares in a peculiar way for the phase of experience in which union is achieved, he does not shun moments of resistance and tension. He rather cultivates them, not for their own sake, but because of their potentialities, bringing to living consciousness an experience that is unified and total, right? So tension, resistance is necessary for aesthetic experience. That's why the artist revels in it, right? That's part of his duty. That's how he creates good art. That's maybe one of the ways that the aesthetic experience is successful, is it's able to create tension, which gets resolved, right? Which is resolved in this equilibrium. Right? And again, this sounds a bit like Schopenhauer, but for different reasons, right? For Schopenhauer, there's inevitable tension in living and being a living being and trying to survive, and sort of there's this notion of the ego that we attach ourselves to, but then every once in a while through artistic experience, we can kind of let go of that and just be one with everything. This is, I think, a little bit more mundane than what Dewey's talking about here. Right? It's just when we're relaxed and we're not worried about the past or the present or the future. In fact, we'll talk about those relations in the next video. He's going to get to that, right? That in our normal mode of consciousness, this is also very Heideggerian or Deweyan. I don't know who because Heidegger maybe would get credit for it. This idea that the past, the present, the future, these are things that we attach ourselves to in our everyday modes, but sometimes we sort of let go of it and just sort of become one, and we get in this sort of flow of things, and we just sort of, we're not stressed out about all this stuff. So, like Nietzsche, and again, I'm sure Dewey would hate the comparison to Nietzsche, but sorry, dude, sorry, there is a lot of parallels. I mean, it's obvious. You're going to see, especially when I get to the next quote, maybe not this one, but the next quote. I mean, in this quote, he seems to be, saying something quite new. I mean, we talked about in one of the final lectures on Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, I think it was lecture 7, we talked about the concept of the theoretical man. Socrates was the sort of archetype, maybe the first example of the theoretical man in the West, Western culture. I think what Dewey is talking about here when he refers to the scientific man is something quite similar to what Nietzsche has in mind. So in contrast to the person whose purpose is aesthetic, the scientific man is interested in problems, in situations wherein tension between the matter of observation and of thought is marked. Of course, he cares for their resolution, but he does not rest in it. He passes on to another problem, using an attained solution only as a stepping stone from which to set on foot further inquiries. Okay, so remember, if you did watch the Nietzsche videos, you'll see that Nietzsche, he compares the theoretical man to a sort of artist, right? That he creates science as his art form, and the pursuit of science itself is what gives his life purpose, right? It's what gives the answer to nihilism, right? To the view that there's no meaning in the world. Of course there's meaning. The meaning is finding truth, and the way you find truth is through science, and that's the pursuit that gives your life purpose. Okay, so that's sort of Nietzsche's account of science, and why science is akin to the artistic endeavor, because it gives us an answer to life. It gives us an answer to the question of the meaning of life, the purpose. It gives us something to do, right? It's meaningful. But here with Dewey, he's saying something that I think Nietzsche would agree with, but I don't really see it in Nietzsche's essay, right? So this idea that there's no resolution per se in the scientific endeavor. Sure, there'll be certain resolutions. These scientists who's studying, trying to come up with a solution to a particular problem, will come up with a solution to that problem. You know, right now we're dealing with this COVID-19 crisis. You know, they're working on a vaccine, I'm sure diligently, in various labs throughout the world. And once they come up with the vaccine, that's great. There'll be a certain resolution to that. But that doesn't end the scientific endeavor. The researcher is going to go on to keep researching the virus, I'm sure. Even after there is a vaccine for it, there's still going to be research done on the coronavirus in all of its forms and manifestations, right? So it's not like the work of art where the artist has this sort of idea, creates a work of art, and then there's this resolution. And then when we see the work of art, we get this feeling of resolution, equilibrium, right? There's this endlessness to the scientific inquiry. And in a way, I mean, I think Nietzsche would get on board with that because, you know, he says, remember that you know, Lessing was honest about this. Lessing said that the scientists they cared more about the pursuit of truth than for the truth itself. But here's where I think Dewey and Nietzsche are quite on board with each other and where they're very controversial. This is a very controversial claim that they're making, that the difference between the aesthetic mode of existence or experience and the, what you might call intellectual modes of experience, are not quite as different as they seem and as most critics or theorists would want us to believe. This is something I think that Nietzsche, Dewey, and you know, I would say probably even Heidegger would agree on, right? That this separation between aesthetic and intellectual or theoretical and even practical, that these are somewhat false distinctions. So there's a long quote. Let's go ahead and plow through it and see what Dewey has to say and try to uncover what his argument is here. I think what we're going to have to do is in the video on this one, right? But I'm going to read this quote. We'll stop it here. I told you the first couple of videos will be very long. And then the next ones will get shorter and shorter. So let's try to wrap it up with this quote here, where again, Dewey is distinguishing between, you know, the aesthetic approach to experience that you might find in an artist creating a work of art and the intellectual approach you'll find in a scientist, a researcher. The difference between the aesthetic and the intellectual is thus one of the place where emphasis falls in the constant rhythm that marks the interaction of the live creature with his surroundings. The ultimate matter of both emphases in experience is the same, as is also their general form. The odd notion that an artist does not think and a scientific inquirer does nothing else is the result of converting a difference of tempo and emphasis into a difference of kind. You know, so for Dewey, the artist and the scientist aren't really doing much different from the sort of standpoint of experience and how they experience things. There's conflict, there's resolution, there's just a difference in tempo, right? There's a difference in tempo and a difference of emphasis. The thinker has his aesthetic moment when his ideas cease to be mere ideas and become corporate meanings of objects, right? He's no longer working with figures and formulae and dealing with these abstract, you know, theories, but he actually sees it work in an experiment. He sees it come to fruition. The artist, on the other hand, has his problems and thinks as he works, right? The problem isn't something that requires a long researched, sort of a research program to arrive at fulfillment. It has to be enacted through creation, right? His thought is more immediately embodied in the object. Because of the comparative remoteness of his end, the scientific worker operates with symbols, words, and mathematical signs. The artist does his thinking in the very qualitative media he works in. And the terms lie so close to the object that he is producing that they merge directly into it. So if you want to think of the scientist as a creator, that's probably a bad way of thinking of it, but just to sort of help with the analogy, if the scientist is a creator and his discovery is his creation, it's something that is far and remote from him until it's discovered, right? While the scientist is doing the research, right? While the scientist is looking under the microscope, taking notes, making all these jotting down all the levels and all the readings on all his devices. Once that scientist, once he or she is done with that, then it's like, yeah, there's this aha moment, just like there is in art. But that aha moment is so remote from that person until it comes. Whereas for the artist, I guess, apparently is going to have this idea in their mind, knows exactly what they want to create. And as they're creating the work, it is directly becoming embodied in that work as they carve that sculpture, as they write their novel, as they paint their painting. They see that artistic inspiration that was in their mind, that was in their thought, directly transferred into something physical. Unlike the scientist who, until the moment of discovery, is working in the completely abstract realm. Okay, so we've already started talking about the environment. We've started talking about the living creature and how the living creature interacts with their environment and how this has a direct impact on experience and on the art that results from that experience, and what makes certain things aesthetic and other things not aesthetic. So we should stop the video here. We're still on chapter 1, believe it or not. Like I said, I warned you about this. There's a lot of information. Once we get through chapter 1, though, I think it's going to be a lot easier and a lot faster. A little more exciting, too, because we're actually going to see his theory in action and how it actually works in particular works of art. So I better just stop the video here. I've already gone longer than I wanted to. I think we're at like over 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes already, 42 minutes. So let me stop it here. See you on the other side. We got one more video to get through chapter 1, and then we'll move on to some really dynamic stuff with Dewey. So thanks for sticking it out. Again, see you on the other side.